Welcome to the first COA Dialogues event of the semester. The title of this discussion and dialogue is The Genesis of Form, and we'll be questioning how we come about an architectural form or how one is realized. And we're going to begin by sort of introducing the members of the COA Dialogues with a little description of what each of our roles is going to be for today or tonight, and it'll just be really quick. We have three new members, 2 returning members tonight, and so this semester sort of marks the transition or the change to the next generation of COA Dialogues. So we're pretty excited about that, and excited about having our new members with us tonight.
Anyways, I'm Kate Hammers. I'm a graduate student here at Texas Tech, doing the MArch with a certificate in urban and community design, and tonight I'll be taking pictures and sort of helping a few of our other members out with their tasks.
I'm Jenna Meeks. I am a third year, and tonight I will be the crowd surfer, so if you have questions, I will be shooting the microphone gun at you.
And I am Marie Barbara Head, and I'll be the group for tonight, and I'm a fourth year.
I'm Valeria Sierra. I'm a graduate student. I am actually doing the media certificate. And my role tonight, I will actually be live tweeting. So just putting all whatever conversations you guys are having, I'm going to put it up on the social network, and also if you guys want to follow us and live tweet with us or give us a shout out, that's what I will be doing tonight. So.
Hi, I'm Caleb Lightfoot. I'm a third year. Tonight I'll be the moderator, so I'll be presenting the brief and also directing the conversation. So thank you guys for coming, and let's get started. We're thrilled by the panelists we have joining us tonight, so I'm going to take a few minutes and introduce them. First, we have Professor Gomez. Professor Gomez received his Bachelor's of Architecture from the Universidad Anáhuac in Mexico City. He completed his graduate studies at the AA in London, as well as CU Berkeley. He got his Master's of Architecture at UNAM in Historic Preservation. He also received his PhD from Tulane University in history/historic preservation. Professor Gomez is an architect with an expertise in theory, criticism, and design. He has also been the director of design at ROTO, Michael Rotundi's office, and a design consultant in the offices of Pugh and Scarpa, as well as Smith Group and Space. Next on the panel, we have Professor Hill. Professor Hill received his Bachelor's of Architecture from the University of Texas Tech. Okay, sorry. And he received his Master's of Architecture with an Energy and Design specialization from the College of Design and Planning at the University of Colorado. As a digital technology consultant, Professor Hill has worked with architectural historians and archaeologists to develop methods of digital documentation using laser scanning for historical structures. Next, we have Professor Glassel. She received her Bachelor's of Architecture from Auburn University, and she also received her post-professional Master's of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin. She has also participated in the Rural Studio, which is an undergraduate program of the School of Architecture at Auburn. She has been a senior urban designer at Earth for Architecture and Planning in Cairo, as well as a design and project architect at Mark Odom's studio. This is her first semester at Tech, and we are very excited to have her on the panel. Thank you. Next, we have Professor Neiman. He holds a Master of Architecture from Yale and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Cincinnati. Since 1983, Professor Neiman has received several honors for a series of self-generated architectural design projects, competitions, and teaching. He also earned the American Institute of Architects Education Honors Award in 1994 and 1998. So we're very excited to have you guys with us today. So let me read the brief. Okay. For this discussion, we'll be questioning the notion of how an architectural form is realized. We'll begin by defining what exactly we mean by the term form. Sanford Quinter describes form as a process by which discernible patterns disassociate themselves from a less finely ordered field, identifying a pattern from a field of raw information. In other words, a system that reveals itself as ordered within an ambiguous field of information. Will we use such a description to frame this conversation in the realm of how architects and designers begin to establish architectural form, with an emphasis on the term architectural. With so many different mediums capable of displaying an idea of form, the question that arises comes from the nature of the inception of an architectural form. Fundamentally, there can be a distinct difference in how the realization of form occurs. Designing the processes with which we arrive at form versus designing the form itself. We will be questioning the difference between the two, as well as where the designer's intuition lies. So to reiterate, do we as designers design form, or do we design a process by which form is achieved?
Please go.
I'll just throw out a first initial concept, and that is, I would say that there are probably 4 major indicators of what generates form. And one of those is tectonics, one of those is the sociology, the social, the cultural, and then a little bit more difficult one to grasp, but the level of consciousness of the designer, the subjective, the kind of really subjective side. And so I would say that as we look at any designers, their forms come out of a combination of those 4 things, with usually an emphasis towards one or the other. So even if you look at a lot of theory, all the theory, Franklin's theory, his push is towards form comes out or should come out of tectonics. And so though he still has to respond to sociology, the cultural, and the level of consciousness of the individual. So anyway, I'll start with that kind of broad map.
I think the segue to that, all of those are processes. So I think that your question as forming it as do we design form or the process to achieve form, I think that it's really a process of form. The ways in which we add subjectivity to each of these types of, if we're going to bank on this word, they're all processes which we associate a rationality to a subjective response that we have as designers to some conditions. And the form would then derive from that. So it's a play of, I guess, rationale and intuition. So then I guess one could argue what intuition is, or if it exists. Trying to talk.
Many of you may have considered that form follows function. This famous kind of phrase about form follows function was achieved early by Sullivan, in which he even stated, I quoted exactly as what he wrote. It says, "It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, physical and metaphysical, things human and superhuman, of all through manifestation of the head, of the heart, of the soul. That's the life. It is recognized in its expression. That form ever follows function. This is the law." That's as scary as hell. And I would say that I would like to start from there. No? Kind of like, we understand that during functionalism, this was the statement, it was a quote. Later on, kind of like came postmodernity, and they quoted it in a completely different way, and they said kind of like function follows form. And nowadays, I would not kind of agree with either one or the other. I would really disagree. Well, we have another personality over here, which is Bernard Schumi, that in the mid-80s, early 90s, he stated that event is what really matters. So form follows event. So from there to now, I think we already challenged that whole notion. And I would start from that particular kind of like statement. Form does not follow function. Function does not follow form. It's a completely different scenario, the one that we're facing right now.
I'm not really interested in form. I'm interested in space. I don't know. I've been struggling with this question since you posed it a couple of weeks ago. guess I would pose a counter question. Why are you so interested in form? Why are you so interested in form? What's the obsession with form? Designing the form, process of achieving. Where does that come from? Why are we asking this question?
Perhaps there is seems to be a large conversation today about form finding. And
Form finding?
And so, so maybe it.
Did your form get lost?
I was just going to
Sorry.
say that. Where did we lose form? Where did it go?
Or about the processes by which form is achieved. And so,
I think that's a good question though. Because I struggle with this also. Like form, what is that? I mean, form in general is either a mediator or an enabler. What is it? It is a spatial. I agree that it should be spatial. That form shouldn't be ever separated. And so to isolate that question just about form seems less architectural and more about something else. Because the ways that anything takes form in life, there's a rationale, or there's something that has logic behind the way that it was created, or the way that it was formed, from natural processes to spatial processes. So isolating form, either in relation to function or to event, or the other way around, seems a bit segregated from the ideas, or the holistic idea of architecture, or space itself.
I can go a bit deeper on that, and considering, I mean, we as architects, where do we get that from? It comes from experiences that we have before. It comes from whatever we observe around us, around the world. So we keep that in our brain files, and then we can pick out that information. So it's about experiences. There's a whole series of theories and philosophies around that particular kind of experience. We can start talking about semiotics and semiology. We can talk about the fields of semiotics like semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics, which is about science and denotata, which is referred things through those signs. This is more like a theory developed by Ferdinand Saussure, and we can go deeper and deeper in those kind of things about analogies, metaphors, symbolism, signification, communication, etc. By other hand, we can talk about Ernest Cassier and his post-idealist idea of symbolism. The form carries certain symbolism, and that form that not carries kind of symbolism is not meaningful. Therefore, it's not a well-done thing. And he expands phenomenology into the philosophy of culture. And he says that humans create a universe of symbolic meanings. So for me, that form that is achieved, that is meaningless, is completely irrelevant.
But how do you define meaning within symbolism and understanding?
Well, I think that's a challenge, no? That when we're creating form, we need to really kind of like support it with a very strong foundation, either in thoughts, in narratives, in order kind of to really make a meaningful symbolism. When we kind of imitate is when kind of form becomes kind of empty, but it sounds to be kind of a contradiction because, as I was saying at the very beginning, we pretty much kind of develop our ideas by everything that we have already in our brain. So there are images that are kind of like already filed inside their previous experiences. So one way or another we cannot create anything from if we've been all our lives inside of a dark room.
Javier, in other words, are you trying to say that you have to have an idea?
Yes. So you say yes.
Yeah.
That for me is a narrative.
So maybe if one is trying to find form finding, maybe they don't have any ideas.
Then
So that's
you refer to experiences. That's what happens.
But form in architectural sense has so many other things. I mean, form isn't just about an idea, it's about people and a city and all the consequences in which architectural form has. So if you're saying that form is just symbolism, or just, it sounds like you're talking about this kind of sculptural shell that sits within a space and doesn't actually provide program or occupation. So the difference between our form and that of an artist is that it's occupiable and that it changes the way in which one moves through it or inhabits that certain function or program. I'll say the occupation way. So
remember what I said at the very beginning, I mean, that I completely deny the aspect of form follows function, because also kind of the human activity changes through time, except the basic ones, sleeping, eating, whatever, I mean, but the human intellect is evolving. Meanwhile, kind of like our experiences with the space completely change. Nowadays, I mean, we have this thing that my grandpa would be surprised if we see it. I mean, and our interaction with this thing in space is entirely different than the interaction that my grandpa had with a dial phone, those ones, or a telegraph. And so except those the basic kind of like human activities will be changing, evolving through time. Therefore, we cannot really talk about kind of like the relationship between function.
Well, but human activity is a function. Also, the way that they interact with space or with form is also a function. So I guess what I'm saying is that I'm denoting architectural space or architectural form as a difference because of that one function, that it has to be occupiable, that it has to be interacted with by a person. And so that in itself gives a different genesis to the ways in which we find the lost form or generate form. I guess, instead of just symbolism, I guess is what I'm saying.
I think that this generator, as you name it, which I will consider more as mapping,
okay,
is just kind of trying to define certain diagrams that may help us to develop a project through the different scenarios we're surrounded by. It could be contextual, it could be cultural, it could be physical or metaphysical. And I mean, that's a good alibi for beginning a project, of course, and give us some relationship to the existing context, which I think is very, very important. But my point is that what comes after that mapping, what comes after that diagramming? We already created a grid system, a series of forces that may be applied into our project, but then what comes after that? If I have an image of a building developed by Zaha Hadid, I may place it on there and I may make all these different rules to work together with that I already have inside of my brain over here. So it's when I question, you know, what really we're trying to achieve when we're talking about the form.
So in that case, is form irrelevant then? And if the conversation lies deeper, then what control do designers have over the outcome of the form of the thing? Or should we not, as students, should we not be concerned with that at all and just focus on the meaning or the narrative or the process? But what control do we have over that formal output?
I got to talk to Lynn.
I think you have as much control as you're willing to take. I think that's a good point. Personally, I would follow that line of thought about form. I think Neiman's actually, because 30 years ago, the dialogue was about space and the creation of space, and not so much form. And I think in the last 20 years especially, we've become very objectified about the building, especially in the journals and the dialogues and high design and stuff like that. It all focused on the surface and the making. That's the reason I think this form thing is in the conversation. And program and those kind of issues were pushed to the side and shelved. And that's just the rotation, I think, of the times. But we've treated the building as a work of art, as an artistic piece, to mainly be seen from the outside. I mean, all these images that you're seeing right now are not about the spaces. they're all about the exterior of the building. I mean, everyone that but there's a whole series of spaces that those shapes create that are actually more meaningful. And so I think the great dialogue is, where have we gotten off track?
Could whoever's in charge of the screen stop for a minute? I find it really distracting, but while you're on this image here, that building is not about form, it's about space. And I was there a couple of years ago. Actually, I've been there, I think 3 or 4 times. And one of the things that's very interesting to me about Ronchamp is the acoustics of the space. I've never been in a space that was so silent when there's nobody in there. You can feel the silence, and it's almost a deafening silence to that space. At the same time, I also was there one time when choir was practicing, and outside of the building, you could really hear how that building is almost a musical instrument. It was incredible sound, even though I'm not Catholic. It was very moving. So, a lot of people look at this and they think of it as some kind of weird form, but it's actually about a very provocative, otherworldly space within. And it's also about light too, because you get different type of light on the inside. A lot of people don't realize that the roof is actually appears to be floating under the massive walls. So you have a strip of light coming in underneath the roof surface, and then you have light coming in through these little apertures. And so the form, I guess, of this building, Ronchamp, is there to serve the space and the light. It's not about itself.
I think that is a good point, that it's performative, and form in so many ways isn't. I think that's why I'm struggling with the idea of form as well, is that it's not set, it's integral, it's operational. Form enables or mediates space to allow your conceptual motives or your contextual motives or your operational motives to really be achieved in the manner in which you intend. So it's not ever separate.
Well, in order to kind of like to get into that point, why don't you please go back into Cerebral Rush or Hernandez Alonso, you were showing some images, I think. Hernandez Alonso. Just 2 minutes ago you showed something. So, which we completely the contrary of what we're perceiving with function. There we go. Whichever product is. Well, let's stop on that one. Whichever, it doesn't matter. So these are extremely provocative forms, of course. Challenging themselves, I mean, they're using the media, I call it computer media. But if there's something that I hardly can see on here is the space. The manipulation of kind of the space here, or those tectonics that we're kind of talking about. This is very complicated, but this is very suggestive. It's also kind of very powerful. So I guess that one of the main motifs which drove the team that organized this to deal with this topic was precisely all the excitement that all this craziness that we see on the screen right now is bringing, and the possibilities, of course, that they will bring us as designers and architects. So my question would be now, taking consideration the Corbusier that we saw a few minutes, is like, are computers helping us evolving this idea of space in architecture? Or they are bringing us into very idealistic kind of spaces, virtual spaces that are driving us nowhere in terms of space?
Well, a tool is a tool. It's all how you use the tool. So I think a lot of people are using the tool in a way that drives this kind of focus, once again, on form. But I think that that's cultural and is temporal. Because we're in a time right now, the last 20 years, we've been in a time where all the focus has been on form, and in architecture. And it hasn't been about the focus. It hasn't been on space and program and those kind of things. The dialogues have all been about form. There's a whole another set of dialogues. And I'm really glad that Bennett brought it up, that in one of those dialogues is that, maybe we should be, working at developing spaces that respond to the way people, they're going to use it, and let form genesis come from that, the program as a driving force, which is one of the things they're looking at Rice, instead of maybe focus on the externalities of things, and also just trying to achieve some kind of artistic, sculptural expression. There's no doubt that Frank Gehry's work is very much about the artistic expression, which is good, because I think we have to have that whole kind of language of activity. But I don't think all architecture should be built out. And there are a lot of other, contemporary examples of buildings that are more about the spaces that are created with those forms.
So you're saying that this is what we just saw is sculpture, it's not architecture.
Yeah, I think it's a sculptural projection of architecture. No.
So you were right.
Frank Gehry, we were lots of work. Yeah. Well, I think the driving force is, and he even says it himself, that he finds his inspiration, his genesis in art. I mean, all you have to do is listen to his words, listen to what he says. His genesis of his architecture is from art.
But it's also materiality, like the way in which Gehry started
tectonics. And once again, you have to bring the tectonics in. You have to, and it's cultural. I mean, he's able to do.
What do you mean by tectonics?
The making,
you keep
the
saying
construction.
Tectonics, and I don't understand what that means.
Okay, well, I'll give you a definition. It's the making. It's the putting, the assembly, the connection.
So why don't you just say making?
Okay. Well, that word to me has been used adequately it's about pulling together the art of making.
I mean, I thought tectonics was about, geological.
That's one definition. that is one definition.
It's just that one of those terms.
That is one definition. But if you read Frampton, it's about tectonics is about connections, the making, the construction, the artistic aspect of
I think we also evolve the definition of architecture in terms of thinking that it's got to be built. I think also built architecture is possible and give us a lot of possibilities. That's what Lewis would have done, that's what many others, I can name a lot of people that have been very influential.
So is he tectonic?
I would see that tectonic is not the matter. We shouldn't force that in order to really have like a nice architectural form is going to be buildable.
But that doesn't deny making. Even if it's not built, it doesn't mean that it's not assembled or made in a
making
is
different than something that is kind of tectonic.
We can use tectonic, I suppose, in 1,000 ways. Maria?
No, I'm just intrigued by this conversation because we started to say I'm not interested in form, I'm interested in space. Right. But can we really separate completely those two? Can we have a form without space? Can we have space without form? Can we go in one direction only? Or is it one informing the other one? Or how? I'm more interested to see I'm not sure we always have connections, but somehow how those two are intricated together. For example, if you are mentioning Bilbao, I was in Bilbao 2 years ago. And yes, of course, we can discuss about the process. Frank Gehry can care less about theory and concepts. He's not a teacher. He's not interested in teaching his way of designing to young generations. He just does because it's intuitive. It's an intuitive process. He's an artist. He's a sculptor. But actually, the space inside was so powerful. So can we say that he's wrong, his approach, just because it's formal? Can we say it's not generating architecture if the space inside is so powerful and he's talking about the city in Bilbao? It's amazing how this building is open to the outside and to the landscaping and to the public place that is just, part of Bilbao. He's bringing Bilbao in. That's why it's successful. So you have a very strong experience, and we talk about experiencing architecture, and is again, a formal exercise that he's doing, but actually his successful experience, his successful architecture is because it's also emotional, is related to the outside, is including the landscaping. He has several factors coming into the place. So I would be careful to say, I see the form and space as two separate entities.
I didn't say that.
No, well, or say, I'm not interested in form, I'm interested in space. Well, let's talk about it. I'm curious.
Well, I'm still not interested in form.
Yeah.
I'm interested in space.
So would you say that the form doesn't really matter as long as you have a strong enough space? Is that more important than?
I mean, I see form as making space. So.
I agree. I don't think that they're definitely not separate. Form has a responsibility, a huge responsibility to, I say mediate again, or just denote experience, or create experience, or live within the city, or exist as architecture. Form that's the responsibility of form. But the idea of being a formal project alone, I suppose, that you have to think of the consequence of form, and that is a spatial situation.
Well, going back to Frank Gehry, I'm talking personally to him. I realized that there's a strong influence by Richard Serra. And Frank Gehry owes a lot to Richard Serra and what he's been doing. So what I found really beautiful in here was that relationship between kind of like the sculptural work by Richard Serra together with what Frank Gehry kind of developed from it. And even there was a moment which they did a couple projects together. This one that was never built was a bridge in New York. And I still know that in certain circumstances, kind of like Richard Serra still kind of like gives advice to Frank Gehry in most of his buildings. Well, now they have 100 buildings in that office, and Frank Gehry himself even kind of like just check them slightly, But at the very beginning, there were very strong kind of connections. And the Guggenheim Museum, even got that room that we see there in the right side, designed for the work of Richard Serra, with expectations from Richard Serra for connecting his sculpture with the architectural piece that evolved from his personal kind of like art. So I think this is a very lucky, kind of fortunate kind of connection between the artist and the architect, and how kind of like form evolved from a very sculpturic piece of art done by an artist.
But it was also the experiential quality within those pieces that kind of created the ways in which that form mimics in a way. So it's still experiential, I still think. The artist is trying to create this exploration within his pieces, and Gehry then is mimicking that. It's not just forming around, it's using form to create experience as well, which is spatial.
That's maybe what I was saying at the very beginning about meaningfulness.
Meaningful, though, is one of those words we use very easily, I guess, I suppose. So I always wonder what meaningful means.
But can't you, what I see an issue with Frank Gehry's work is the inability to, or the misunderstanding of formal gestures being introduced in other scenarios which aren't successful. If we were to take a Bilbao formal gesture and position it in a different context, we see the other one on the right, which is in the small village in Spain, and it sort of appears as a spectacle in the landscape. It's this little dot that shines, reflections of it. What's important about the huge difference is that This is purely formal. And it has nothing to do with these relationships that Maria was pointing out.
Right.
And so, not to confuse the students too, but it's not that you can take on these formal processes similarly in every variable situation or circumstance. And so I still think that in a way that there still has to be a conversation about procedural methods in order to achieve formal qualities. And with Frank Gehry, I think it falls short in a lot of those circumstances. And in Bilbao, he seemed more focused not on form, but rather the outcomes that and the effects that they have within the city landscape, which is kind of similar to this, but it's not spatial at all. While Sarah is, in Bennett's kind of definition, that's totally about space.
Right.
Which is what is driving the curves and the folds of that material.
I would say that form follows research and intuition.
Research, maybe that's next time.
Yeah. But I think in that notion, form is indexable, right? Form is an index of all these different areas at which we're responding to, whether it's context, or you can say mapping or anything like this, but it goes back to the idea that it does have a responsibility to respond to where it is, that form can't just happen anywhere, that there's too many things at which it affects or has consequences upon, that the procedure or the processes of form should include all of those things. It's real complicated form. That's what I'm saying.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is the characteristics of that form, if they are repeated, it doesn't equal success.
Right.
And in Gehry, he tries that, and I think that's where a lot of the projects where he fails.
So I think that's happening with all the famous firms that they start getting hundreds of projects per year, that then they got a very successful formula and they replicate it. And even the clients are kind of asking for them, they're hiring them to do this architecture, we're expecting them to do mini build clouds everywhere. So then it's when the architecture becomes weak. Somehow the power that Bilbao had couldn't be surpassed by many other buildings.
The misunderstanding with Bilbao is the reason it works is not necessarily because of the form, it's because of a series of other performances that accompany its position in Barcelona, the way in which it embraces the bridge, the end of the development area that comes up from the south, how it sits on the axis of that road that comes up to it. The interior space is dynamic, but would it have to have that form? Not necessarily. And the interior space could be almost like it is without necessarily having the accoutrement on the outside. I love it as an object, and to some extent it really changed everything. But even this room, the Sarah exhibit was the first exhibit there, he designed this room for that exhibit, but it really wasn't successful. And part of it was that the scale of the pieces that Sarah did for the room really overwhelmed the room. And the room itself didn't have the kind of, it almost competed with the pieces. And then left without the pieces, because I saw them both with the pieces in and without. Without the pieces, then the room is peculiar. It's not expressive in a particular way, nor is it particularly friendly to put things that's put in it. It's just kind of an oddity. I think Bilbao is a seminal work, so it sounds like I don't. But I guess my point is that Gary's success, to some extent, is his ability to appropriate and employ a particular artistic intuition. On the other hand, though, his success architecturally comes from good architecture. It comes from thinking about the urban space and how one moves through it. It comes from thinking about the way in which the architectural space is occupied and how one moves through it. And when he's really thinking about those things well, then that space works well and that form works well. Like if I've never seen this one, but there's the museum in, I think, Minneapolis, for example, which is really kind of, it's a narrow site with a sort of a box-like structure that has his form attached to the end, which has really no essential consequence other than the fact that it's kind of nice to look at from across the river.
Wasn't that before build up?
It was before build out, yeah. But his thinking that's in build out goes back 20 years before build out.
It's kind of interesting because it seems like the nature of the conversation has now shifted not towards genesis of form, but how do we define quality of form and space? In other words, how do we determine if something is better than something else? And how do we get to those qualities of form? Which I think is a much more interesting discussion.
I think, question.
There's a question.
My name is Caitlin Barhorst. I'm a second year, and I know you just kind of went off into the other direction, but going back to the question about why we're focusing on form, I was kind of thinking about how, because our job is to choreograph space for other people to interact with and to experience. So I guess where's that line to understanding for non-architects? I was thinking for form, I guess most from my understanding of non-architects and how they see a building is oh, that's cool, it looks really awesome, but they don't understand what generated that form. So what would you say form does for the understanding and interaction for I guess visibility and
space, people? I think so. Are you asking what the role of form is and how you inform people of your intention as an architect, or?
If you know, architects are going to understand space differently. I've been brainwashed by myself.
Yes.
So, I guess, just understanding of, form for non-architects, what I'm saying is the first thing they're going to see is their first impression. There was a conversation about how it's not form and function are separate. Well, the function of the building is to have this narrative of circulation through, showing the person, the visitor, whoever is interacting with the space, what your big idea is. And I guess my question is, what's the importance of form on the basis of non-architects understanding your big idea or your function of the building?
I would argue that you should never get into the habit of explaining your intentions. Okay? In other words, I think that's to a client, no, you don't want to talk to him or her about, oh, I was thinking about this, or there's a really neat skit.
I don't know if I totally agree with that.
I do. I think what they need to do is the public will draw out of that what it needs and what it wants to see. And that's the connection. You know what I mean? Have you successfully connected to the public? Have you provided a wonderful space or a functional space? Have you an intriguing form that some people would say is ugly as sin, and others would say it's wow, that's cool. That's just So I would really stay away from trying to explain.
But are you to try to explain that? I think I totally disagree, actually.
Okay.
As an architect, one has to take a position on the problem at hand, because there is. I liked how you said ambiguous field, for example, which I don't know if there's ever an ambiguous field. That's one I was sure. To take a position on it or have intention is what kind of makes us all different. Is what makes all of our designs different. So it's that intention in which form starts to suggest the ways in which I decided to organize my space as opposed to you. So without that type of explanation through form or spatial organization or concept, then I think that you miss the relationship between that type of engagement and the ways in which, maybe that didn't make sense. You're missing that type of engagement. I'm going to end it there.
Yeah, but the public, they don't need to know that. They either experience it or they don't. It doesn't matter whether you intended. You may have intended this to be a bright and wonderful space.
100%.
And the thing is the public sees it as ugly as sin. And it's terrible. Acoustics are horrid, whatever. Okay? So,
I think now we're getting into different topics. I would like to point, because I think the students want to see this, but I was kind of following in the poster and everything. Bring some images by Marcos Cruz. He's got a theory that is the neoplasmatic architecture. Marcos Cruz is the director at Bartlett. He's creating a very interesting kind of research on Bartlett, in which he's trying to bring a connection between the human body and architecture again, and the form making on architecture as well, in a very intense way. And he says that during kind of the last years, we've been understanding the human being just as a standardized being, and he's trying kind of to approach it in a completely different way. And this is the role of what's going on in Bartlett School of Architecture in London, in which they're trying to connect nature with form making in a very strong way. Another person that is doing something quite interesting in form development is Carl Schuh, with his lab that is named Ex-Avia. And he's got programming computers with very special programs. He's got these beautiful silicon graphic computers. And what he does is to bring kind of DNA codes into that program and allow the computer itself to start developing forms. But just kind of finding these kind of DNA connections as how a plant grows, or a human being kind of is developed as well. It's done. And then we can bring some images as well from Carl Schuh, CHU, which is very interesting kind of research development. He somehow is using the computer as a DNA factory that by branching systems develops something and creates kind of completely unexpected forms. And the last one, we have a couple more over here. The other one is Tom Wiscombe, in which he's being kind of inspired kind of as well in nature, and particularly in dragonfly. And he sees in the transparency of the wings of the dragonfly as a very interesting kind of way to understand the structural systems. And from there kind of develop architecture. So each one of these architectural systems, as weird that they can look, evolves from reading nature in a very kind of clear way in order to kind of develop something. So I think there's a lot of colleagues out there. They are trying to create kind of form by very specific agendas and very specific research agendas, which I find very inspiring and I find very, very powerful. So, and there's many more. I mean, Mark Forns, who else? Marcos Novak. They're doing kind of these same kind of experiments.
So are you saying that's the future of architecture?
It's happening now. It's not the future. It's happening.
Yeah, but I think all of those people are very different. I would not.
Of course, I'm not grouping them, but I'm just trying to explain that there's a lot of people doing with different agenda, kind of research on form creating an architecture.
So it's form finding.
That way if you want.
Yeah.
But there's an intention behind it. It's not just an empty form finding, which that's something I wish kind of the students will understand here after they get these magics of parametrics in design. That is not just about what beautiful things you can create with a computer. No? I mean, it's that there should be something behind it to support your form-making ideas.
To get back to Bennett's comment, that there should be fundamentally an idea there somewhere.
I mean, this is gorgeous. I see. Mark Forn's pieces, absolutely outstanding and very inspiring.
But again, are we not going again into space?
Right. Well, there's a space inside here.
Yeah, so can we really think about that wherever we go, in which direction we go with form making or form finding or form exploring or form researching, at the end of the day, we have to relate that with a spatial quality.
Well, and by that, those are
generate.
two things in architecture.
Cannot be just an abstraction.
They just made something cool.
Well, those things are very bound. I mean, you can't, in architecture, at least when you make something big enough, it's going to create space. It's maybe, it doesn't create inhabitable space, then there's a question there. But if you create something big enough, there's that interaction between, but it's where you can put your focus, too. In other words, there are architects who put more focus on space. The form is going to be there. It's got to come out of it. You can't create the space without form.
I don't know. I'm a little disturbed by what just been said because it sounds a lot like space is just a resultant. You make this crazy form. Maybe you have an idea behind the crazy form, but the space is just what's inside of it, and that seems a little simplistic.
Every single person that I just named is searching for space.
I'm not talking about what you just said. I'm talking about what some others have said around that. That it seems that space is just an afterthought. It's not the impetus of what has happened.
I think it can be the impetus. And I think should it be the impetus, the only impetus? I don't know. I think that's...
Well, there I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Why would it be though? Why wouldn't space, which needs to be occupied to make architecture exist, why wouldn't that be ever the impetus?
No, the only impetus. I think they're all. I think you've got to deal with it all.
Well, now you're getting kind of semantic.
I mean, open...
No, I think it's got... I honestly believe you've got to include it all. You've got to include all the cultural aspects of what the context. You've got to include how it's made and how it's going to be built. Because if you don't include that, then it won't be built. And then you've got to include the program and the sociological aspects of the building.
I'm sorry, but I find that very old school. Sorry, open Marcos Novak and his liquid architecture.
Somewhere along the line, Javier, someone's going to test those forms against their ability to be used.
Here we are. This is his car cube.
Someone's got to test that.
Marcos is talking about liquid architecture. He's talking about electronic space. And he's saying us that the space do not need to be physically built in the environment with bricks and stones in order to be space. He's telling us kind of like the media that we have now can allow us to understand the space as well as in a virtual way. Why not? I think that's absolutely exciting.
I think, this is a pretty interesting idea. I know Marcus really well. I worked with him for 6 years. What Marcus is saying is that cleverly, one can create a space you can't inhabit, but you can we are good enough now to be able to animate the space so that you don't need to inhabit physically to see it as space.
Yes.
And that's a pretty paradigm shifting observation.
But you know that actually, I would add Levius's earlier works, even before Marcus's, with the storm and the tension fields. That the tension fields, I find Marcus's work, some of the other work that you were referring to, I would not add Tom Wiscombe or those guys into this. I think it's a completely different thing that I actually don't agree with, Tom. But and these were inverting spatially, that instead of it being about a formal skin, they become about an extraction of spatial consequences that exist in our environment. And they're almost revealing space rather than trying to envelope. And so if you think about this work and Marcus's, I find it very similar. And you don't really experience the tension field. You experience it through the visualization of seeing space rather than us trying to find what space looks like. So it's suggestive of space, not form. Now, Tom Wiscombe's work is, I would disagree with you, Javier. I think it's all about form. If you look at most of his sections, building sections, the space is completely unrelated to the formal gestures of either the envelope or the characteristics that exist. So I think we're talking about two different, that's why I kind of wanted to make sure that we're not plugging all of those people together, because they're very, very different.
Everybody's working in their own realm and with their own personal interest. And I find interesting the work of Tom Wisconsin. I would not judge that it's isolated. And if you really read how he achieved those kind of particular forms, it makes sense. There's lectures from him in YouTube that you can look at how he goes step by step, understanding kind of nature and developing kind of his particular kind of forms. The resulting forms, I mean, could be beautiful, could be really ugly, but that's a completely different statement. I will talk the same as when we talk about the German Expressionism. In order to be art, not necessarily to be pretty. I mean, it needs to be meaningful. And for me, architecture should have the same statement. In the moment that is deep in meaning, then it will be interesting and will be kind of productive for the future.
I think the fact that both of you, though, talked about how space is suggested or perceived, and it is not related to form almost at all, goes back to the beginning conversation, like why are we isolating the discussion or genesis of form and as it relates to space, or where does that come with the discussion, I suppose? Like, just to suggest space, like Maria was pointing out, where does form relate back to that? Are these things, even though we're saying that those moments are suggesting space, why aren't those still formal? I mean, inherently they have a form and they are defining a space, but it's, where does the suggestion come through formally? Does that make any sense? Maybe not. So I guess I'm curious, are y'all suggesting that form isn't necessary?
Well, they're fields, they're not forms.
Right. I understand what they are, but where do they come to start to defining or suggesting? Where does that border form? Maybe that's gone too far.
So I have a question.
Completely different from Marcus Novack in the sense that Marcus's proposal is that you can create spaces you can't inhabit, and that those spaces can be enormously powerful, and not just in a geometric sense. But picture this: he can create things that can be given the same kind of quality of how do we experience space. We experience it through light and textures, and he can create forms that have that. So you can go there, even if you can't be in it. You can go there in your mind and have the same kind of reactions you might have in the Villa Rotunda on a brightly lit day or in the evening, for example, where the light has a particular kind of quality. And I think that's a kind of that sort of presence in the world is one that's never been there before.
So students posing a question over here. On that.
So since we're kind of getting back to genesis of form now, my question is based off of a book I just read. It's Arthur Koestler, Ghost in the Machine. He had a comment in there that said there was ghost structures that could overpower the human intellect and kind of common sense into doing what the structure is saying. So my question is this, the age-old question: is there good and evil structures, or forms in this case? Are there forms that can be inherently bad for the whole, or are there forms that can be inherently good for the whole? Or is it neither?
Who are you directing your question to? When you're talking about machines, you're talking about computers?
No, I'm really talking about forms and how they really function.
Like the idea of the building as a machine.
Yeah, going off of that, yes.
I think that there definitely can be bad and good machines, as in buildings, ones that can negatively impact. I think that architecture and space have that power. The ways in which the consequences of what you design, the consequences of your form can impact the way in which people move through it or move around it or live within it or walk to their neighbor's house or go across the city, or maybe they take a different route because of your building or because of your form or space. So I think there can be negative things that you can do just as much as there can be positives. I don't know if that answers your question or just...
No, it does, but it leads to kind of the second part of the question. How do we find those good or bad forms? What's the separation?
I don't think there's good or bad forms, because that is very abstract. I mean, Is good or bad spaces? Yes. But forms, I mean, they're evolving. Our understanding of forms completely change every year. And with more ways of creating completely different scenarios, I mean, forms are challenging times. When I studied architecture, was your age, I mean, I had my T-square and my triangles, 45 degree, 30, 60. Every single building was orthogonal or 40-degree angles. And that's it. We had no other choices. We were very adventurous, we used a compass, okay? And now we have to produce with the computers, I mean, with all these programs and everything, I mean, can go far away of what we were even expecting to. And I think it's going to continue evolving.
I want to be clear that I didn't mean subjectively good or bad form. That I meant you can oppress people with your form. You can make them feel smaller. You can make them feel bigger. Not subjectively that is a good form or bad form, but objectively I feel more negative about my experience in your space, or I feel more positive.
What I was more talking about was the negative implications of a form. Like the form as itself having negative implications or positive implications around it. So not that there's a bad one.
Just mimicking. I mean, if you kind of like, you're just mimicking what other people have kind of already created with a previous kind of, I would say again, research, not using another word. I mean, if yours is just about imitating, copying, I mean, it's meaningless, regardless of how beautiful it can be.
I want to get, because I don't agree with the terms, good and bad, evil, to describe art form. Because that implies a moral judgment. In other words, you've got to make a moral judgment to get there. And I think really what we're more interested in is quality. Okay? And there are higher and lower levels of quality. And I think what we're trying to reach for is a very high level of quality, which I think is a better way to look at that. And so, yes, there are low levels of quality of space and form, and there are higher levels of quality of space and form. And I think the way that you get there as a student, you go, you see architecture, you experience architecture, you look, you intently observe, and how did they put it together? How people watch the people? How are they reacting to the space? How are they reacting to the form? I think that's how you really get there. It is through just passionately involving yourself with the architecture around you and studying it, you know. But I really don't think it's a bad and evil or you know, it's the devil and I mean, that's when you say bad and evil, there's devil, we got the devil over here and we got architecture that's godly over here. I just don't buy into that dichotomy, and I don't buy into that language, because I think that's a moral judgment language, and it's really about quality and about higher and lower levels of quality.
But I think semantics aside, architecture does have the power to make you scared, or make you excited, or make you happy or sad. All of these moments are
any of those can be positive. Any of those experiences can be positive.
Semantics aside, I think that though I like the idea of architecture as a machine, and how that can then invoke or elicit an emotion or a feeling of I won't use evil, even though that's great. Evil and fantastic, what would be the opposite?
Well, I disagree with the idea of bringing back the architecture as the machine Cagabite. I mean, not all turn back the Corbusier is far back there, and he didn't even create it himself. He just pulled it out from the Russian constructivists, I mean, which they were creating architecture as machines in order to create a scenario, a social scenario in relationship to the revolution. So I think we already move away from that. I mean, we can talk about architecture as a body. We can talk about architecture as something related to nature that has bones and has skin and has veins and has arteries and has muscles. But I will relate it more to a Francis Picabia kind of experiment. But I would be very careful in using the term machine again, kind of like the connotations that it has.
So maybe to like follow up on these questions and kind of reiterate, Professor Gomez, something you said earlier about like the work of Tom Wiscombe, you said that it was in tension with a process, right? So maybe going back to maybe part of the original question, number one, as designers, how do we evaluate those forms and the spatial effects they have? And maybe tying into the question that was just asked, or maybe what Professor Hill has been saying about the quality of form, if we're applying processes to intention, is that enough? Is that all we need? Or how do we further evaluate the spatial implications of those?
It is a scientific process. Some processes run us anywhere bring us failure. But I think within the failure we're learning something as well. I think the overall thing is to kind of like move forward, kind of the humankind that what we're developing our lives and what is going to happen later.
I think also,
the transcendence, that's a word.
Sorry, Adia. I think also you have to be rigorous, and I think also you have to be in control of what you're doing. How are you in control of what you're doing? Understanding what you're doing. We saw Marcus novels, we saw cartoon, nothing is new there. This is work that they are doing since 15 years. And it's a continual repetition, a reiteration, and it's a continual testing of the process and the steps of this process. You have to understand the phases. You know, it's a progression, it's a validation of the step before with the step after, and it's a continual integration of what you do day by day. So if you are not in control, there's no sense, and you can generate infinite forms that they don't respond to any what, right? Just because we are generating something that turns out to be appealing graphically. No, it has to have a foundation, what you are doing. And important really is the control of every step.
There's discipline.
And parameters.
There's a lot of discipline in the form-making process and research that goes to there.
I think parameters is a good that's a good thing to bring up. Also, I mean, I think parametricism as a separate entity, like parametricism is really just using parameters, which we use all the time. So how does the architect respond to those constraints, or whether they're site constraints or natural constraints or occupational constraints or programmatic constraints? Those responses, those always influence as well. And it's rigor with understanding even code constraints, how you work within that. Did I miss something?
See, I think the focus on form, in some of these examples that have been put up, I think to a certain extent it kind of demeans what they're doing. I don't think what they're doing is about form. It's really about a project. Each of these individuals have a project. They have a set of ideas that they're working on, that they're developing over time, the discipline, the rigor that Maria is talking about. And I think if you referred to, I think if Geary were here and you were just talking about that he was only interested in form, I think he'd be insulted.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think that's what he sees himself as doing, and I certainly think that Carl Schroed would take offense to that. That what he's doing is just playing with form, So I think, again, I go back to what I said at the beginning, is I really am curious about why there's this question about form, when really the question should be about, do you have a project? Do you have an idea behind what you're doing? Rather than, I'm obsessed with forms, or I like certain forms, or I want to generate a bunch of different forms so I can find the right form, or I can find a good form, or a bad form, or a happy form. Or maybe if I play around with the computer long enough, maybe I'll run into some happy accidents.
And as I was telling you at the very beginning, everything is about semiology when we're talking about form. We always relate the forms we're looking on the screen with something, an experience that we have, and make some sort of an analogy with it. If I show this work to my mother,
she will say, what the heck is that? That's so crazy. She will never understand what is behind it. But if I show it to an artist that is doing post-Pollock kind of expressionist art, he will say, wow, that's absolutely outstanding. It's awesome. So we always relate what we have in front of us in terms of form with experiences. And we create analogies, so we kind of compare it to something else. And so the word form itself is irrelevant. I think the word form, when it's proceeding a particular kind of agenda or a very strong research, whatever intention, then it can be meaningful.
So go ahead.
See, I think the real dangerous word is formalism.
Yes, I agree on that.
Yeah. But don't we see examples of architects or designers? I'm gonna.
Yeah, we see all kinds of examples.
But yeah, examples of designers claiming that their project is involving all of these other considerations or criterias, and the reality is it's just really formally a series of exercises of form, whether they're intentionally acknowledging that they're exploring form or not.
You asking me?
Yeah, you're the one that brought that up. I think the claiming or understanding is slightly different too. Do you understand, does your mother understand the form, or does she just not understand the process?
Both.
Geez, my mom liked what I was doing just because it was me doing it.
But when I was in school,
I never got any issues.
my father was asking me if I needed help, if I wanted him to help me doing something. I was scared. I was going away from here.
Was he asking to help you, or
yes.
was he asking
when I was
if you
doing
needed help? There's a distinction.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
But like example, you work in it.
What about my work?
You're repeating your forms.
I never think about form.
But somehow kind of like you created a particular language.
Yeah.
And you become obsessed with your language in a certain way.
Yeah.
And are you evolving with that? Are you experiencing new things? Or are you just kind of waiting for things to happen while you're kind of doing models with squares and monkeys like that?
The question about, do you think about form or do you think through form?
Yes.
I think the common inspiration, the aspiration that we have is to think through form.
Isn't a meaning of form having good form? Having, like for instance, if you're exercising or if you're doing some kind of gymnastic thing, there's the question of whether or not you have the right form, or let's say a really good pitcher. They talk about the mechanics. That if you don't have the right, if your mechanics are off, you'll get hurt. You'll have an injury and so forth. I think that's the same kind of thing.
So that could be thought of as a matter of efficiency, or it can be thought of as a matter of elegance. And I think what is interesting about architecture is the morality of architecture moves between those two poles. The dialogue that we have when we are consciously trying to understand the way in which we create better forms is indeed partly between those two poles of efficiency and elegance. And there's not an answer, because it's not about the answer, it's about the dialogue. You had the initial thing on the board about, is it form or is it process? I think that's the fundamental, my opinion is that's the fundamental question.
See, to answer Javier's question, I mean, when I'm doing what I'm doing, I'm intensely thinking about what I'm doing.
So there's a research process of it. There's an agenda that you're bringing.
Yeah, it's not a happy accident. It's not that, I'm just messing around with stuff and all of a sudden, something happens and, that's it.
Yeah, well, that's what from my experience. Just wait for the Holy Spirit to bring you kind of light and light you into your project. It will never happen.
I think it's about working through the process.
There's discipline. There's a lot of discipline in the process, I guess. That's important. And I think that's what most faculty in studio are trying to get you to do is work through a process, whatever that process might be, and it's going to vary from studio to studio. It's going to vary from their approach and how they perceive architecture to be done. But what you pull out of that is that there's multiple ways to get to that idea, and that though I think all of them would agree that there has to be a certain level of rigor about what you're doing, and that lack of rigor and lack of caring about what you're doing is what produces lower levels of quality. I mean, that's the way.
But I thought you said before that there wasn't any distinction between good form and bad form.
There isn't good and bad. But there are, once again, I use the term quality, that there are higher
quality good or bad quality? I mean,
there's higher levels of
quality is always the same.
There's higher levels of quality.
Uniform quality.
It's a range. There's a higher level of quality. But when you talk about good, well, we're getting into I'm glad to go into it.
I think it's just successful execution with one's intention, not just good or bad. But I think
it sounds like good.
It sounds like good.
But I love your term evil form, because I think that's the most amazing one.
I mean, leaf-skin's pretty scary. I mean, did he scare a small child that would walk? I read an article that they would walk into it, but I think that that was me. That's a small child.
Look at that grin on his face.
That looks like the Death Star.
No, the worst is when you meet his wife. Then you get scared.
Right.
Where did he get those glasses?
He's a lovely person. I mean, Erskine is the most beautiful human being on earth. That's for sure. Absolutely. He's on the moon all the time, but that makes him
He's on the moon?
all the time. All the time. He's just thinking Mars and Saturn and the stars. And his wife is the one that grounds him. Like, calm down to earth. It's time to be pragmatic.
That must explain that picture.
Right.
He's the most amazing person ever.
But I think rigor or process of form, like to go back to Gary, I think he's a really good example. This is center in Toledo, Ohio, is this really rectilinear idea of metal and copper, and the way that he was experimenting with that, and the way that just over 15, 20 years, how he started to develop these ideas of materiality within, and how that can be expressive of form or suggest form or not. But, I mean, that's a Gary project. And you can see if we're talking about repeating a process or repeating an idea, it's that rigor which allows you to develop or execute the quality, or the connection between form and space, I think, in the ways that you intend it to be. So when I first saw this project, I definitely didn't think it was Gary, but you look closer and you walk around and you see some of the spatial ways in the interior or these crevices, and you see these same ideas he has about how space and form relate to one another. They're just translated through innovations that he has found or that he started to understand through iteration.
You know that is interesting on this project, that he's going back to his beginnings.
Well, this is a long time ago. This was beginning. I forget when this was done.
Because one of his very, very early projects is a studio, photographer studio in Culver City, in Los Angeles. It's the most boxy project that you've ever seen in your life, but it's gorgeously executed.
This was early. This was 80s.
This is very similar to what he did in Cincinnati.
Yeah. Also in Cincinnati, yeah. So the ways in which form That's why I believe that Gary does have a position on space, and that he got to a point later in his career where Bilbao was this big hit. So let's just make a Bilbao. But he has an intention.
Well, there's a discipline and there's a trajectory, of course, of his work, and we can read it very carefully. And before this, I mean, after this as well. And I see that threshold is when his doctor, his psychiatrist, can introduce him to Ed Moses and Richard Serra.
Yeah, and that could be true too. And even his way he addresses lighting, like there's some similarities between Bilbao and this, and those spatial consequences. The ways in which he's deciding where glazing should go, or these kind of crevices, or these ideas of overlapping, that's still suggested in both forms, I think. So that's where form becomes an enabler. Form facilitates your kind of idea of space. That's why I don't think it's necessarily separate, but integral. For many reasons, but why also I think you should have intention and suggest that intention to the public as well. Just to bring that back. Professor Coe.
All right, well, thank you. Do we have any final questions from the audience? Anything?
Somebody's
I have a question. To finish what Mary Michael is saying, which is very opening up to me several things, and I think I agree, we should not talk about good and bad, and we should talk instead something that provoke a reaction.
Right.
Can be a disturbance, disturbing us, but somehow we react to the building,
yes.
Right? And this goes against the fact that architecture is about distraction. When I say distraction, I mean, I have a building in front of my house, I go out every day, millions of times during the years and years and years, and I cannot describe it. If you ask me, describe me the building that is in front of your house in details, you don't know. So those buildings are against distractions. Or let's say they try to provoke or to initiate or activate a reaction. It can be a disturbing reaction, can be instead you feel happy, you have some emotional reaction to it. And that's what I'm interested in. And I believe that those architects are doing this. And I believe that the formal, if we want to continue to call it formal, exercise that is associated to that is reinforcing this, all right? But I would like to go instead into something else. When I saw the title of your dialogues, The Genesis of Form, I said, oh well, this is familiar. And I thought about Manuel de Landa, and when he wrote The Laws and the Genesis of Form. And in that text, in that article, he's talking about the significance of the materiality. And he's talking about singularities and systems that cannot be disjuncted from materiality. And there are formal systems that include the idea of materiality. And I would like to go into that. Can we have form and materials into the conversation?
Well, you just touched a very interesting point, which is systems.
Systems.
Which actually Mandela is very strong on that, and he acts as a post-Deleuzian person, and I think he's the top philosopher right now, and the one that should influence us the most at this precise moment. Somehow he's understanding that everything as a form is created through a system, or different systems that are performing on it. And he talks about the bees, how they kind of create their kind of bee boxes, whatever they do, and how the systems, the queen bee goes behind the other bees. And he says the human beings, we act as well with systems. And everything in our neurons are kind of doing inside here is just a systems of electrical kind of like inputs that are given from one side to another one. So when we're talking about machine, I think the machine is a human being itself. And we start kind of processing. That's a very complicated, elaborate kind of computer inside our brains. So I totally agree that somehow kind of form could be a resulting force of a series of systems.
But the way that materialities interact with it is it makes the form participatory in your experience itself. So the haptic or tactile nature of materiality is how form starts to interact as well. So it's not just the defining of the space or the choreographing of one's movements, but it's also how you participate within that space or how the light is affected. So the material systems, either exploiting it or denying it, both change the experiential quality or the ways in which I just naturally interact with it, totally. If I see something heavy or rough, it's also just like emotion. I'm scared of that material. It could also be possible, I think.
But think about the properties of materials, right? And how can they inform the form?
Oh, totally.
Or is it the design starting with the material, the design process, or is it vice versa? Or is it maybe a mutual interaction or integration? I mean, I'm interested about the moments, right, of the process through
when it's
the
materiality.
Yeah, exactly.
That is a good question.
I think it comes in from the beginning. Once again, I think, and I'll use the term again, I'm sorry, the tectonics of what you're doing have to begin at the beginning. You have to know how you're going to get there. You have to, the program, the sociology, what you're doing has to be a part of those initial formations, some level of it. That culture and the realization that you are a cultural being. You may believe you're counterculture, but the fact is, the fact you're counterculture makes you a part of the culture. And where you are subjectively yourself in self-awareness, you know, and what you believe in. And all four of those things have to come, talking about general systems theory, okay? All four of those things have to happen at the same time. And you can put emphasis on one or the other, and architects do. They push their emphasis around those four categories. Some people focus primarily on program, but the reality is they have to deal with the tectonics. They have to deal with the culture, context, and there are subjective decisions that they make about their own state of mind and where they are. So some people put, you know, emphasis on the structure and how you make it as a form from it. Some people put emphasis on culture, you know, historicism. I don't think any of that is good or bad, you know what I mean? Does quality architecture come out of the event? That's all I'm worried about. Does quality architecture come out of the event? You know, no matter how you get there, does quality architecture come out of the event? And I don't think you can get to quality architecture without doing all four of those things at some level from the beginning.
I think from the beginning, materiality, that totally makes sense, but I think that you and the material can work together back and forth, kind of in an iterative process to say, sure, I'm really excited. Concrete is going to assist in my idea of, you know, oppression and fear. So how I start to work with concrete or challenge or innovate the ways in which concrete is assembled together can start to go back and forth. And then maybe at one point you've decided you've got concrete so thin to such an extent that you actually want to move to stone or start to think of other kind of compressional materials. I think that it can all be back and forth, and that one is a driver for the other, and it can be a conversation that you have with your ideas or your materiality, which is exciting, I think.
Because I think architecture is going into materiality more and more and more.
Right.
And more than thinking about a digital practice, I'm thinking about material practice, which might include the idea of being digital, of course, but also many other ways. So,
well, the ways that we innovate how materials are used. I mean, the same with Gary. He wouldn't have gotten to titanium if he hadn't started with copper.
Yes.
And seeing the properties in which it's pliable or which it can be cut or which it can be formed in those types of scenarios. And that changes the ways in which he shaped Bilbao or shaped the space.
And it's sort of like what we were watching earlier with Skylar Tibbetts has a new project out, and he's calling it 4D. And essentially it's these material strands that are self-assembly, which if you think about that, that's extremely amazing.
Yeah.
So these components are organized with intelligence between one component to the next to self-assemble into a particular form gesture. And it comes basically through DNA structures and how components and DNA strands operate. So I agree with Maria. I think material systems are at the forefront of an architectural research to inform not our external gestures on formal characteristics, but that the way they self-assemble.
Right.
And I think that's going to happen more and more as we...
Which is why construction is so important. A little cloud out there.
All right, are there any closing comments from the panelists? Or?
I'll make mine.
So I would say like form follows narrative, or form follows discipline, form follows research. That are my 3 points.
I guess I just want to clarify again that I was not saying good or bad as a subjective nature, but that I was saying evil and happy as an experiential nature. But I think form can be very exciting and investigatory, and the ways that you start to define your own relationships between form and space are what are going to define your own genesis of architecture. So form and space equal architecture in ways, and we've kind of talked a lot about semantics, but it's how you start to define your own intention within the profession or within the career, either through materiality or choreographing space or form or quality. What do these words mean to you, and how do you start to execute them rigorously? That's all I have to say about that. For now. For now.
Until lecture tomorrow.
Until lecture tomorrow.
I just looked up tectonic. I don't know, it says here, geology of relating to changes in the structure of the Earth's surface.
Did you look at the second definition?
There is no second
Yes,
definition.
there is.
Not according to this.
What dictionary did you get? The second definition is also the making and construction of things.
Yeah, that was,
Simply
that was,
your
that was,
components.
I found that in the Urban Dictionary, but this is not. So, I don't know how to say it. That's my closing statement.
All right, well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you, panelists, for a great conversation.